She rolled her eyes when the invitation arrived in her mailbox, crumpled it up, and told her sister she'd rather spend Saturday doing literally anything else than picking up trash with a bunch of suburban do-gooders who thought they were saving the world one plastic bottle at a time. What she didn't expect was for the organizer to track down her phone number and call her a selfish disappointment to the family name. What she really didn't expect was to show up anyway, wearing old clothes and attitude, ready to prove exactly how little she cared about their precious community project. But when that same organizer saw her walking across the sand and went pale as driftwood, stammering, "Wait, you're Commander Miller from the Environmental Task Force?" everything changed. Every single person on that beach was about to learn that sometimes the person you judge the hardest is exactly the one who's been fighting battles you didn't even know existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock screamed at me from the nightstand at 4:30 in the morning, same as it had every weekday for the past 8 years. My apartment in downtown San Francisco was still dark, fog rolling past the windows like smoke from some distant fire. Most people my age were probably just getting home from bars, but I'd been asleep since 9:30 because that's what happens when your job starts before the sun comes up and ends long after it goes down. I pulled on my running gear and hit the streets while the city was still mostly asleep, my feet pounding against pavement that was slick with morning dew. 3 miles along the waterfront, past piers where commercial fishing boats were already preparing for their daily runs, past the old Embarcadero where homeless camps had sprung up under overpasses like urban forests. The smell of salt air mixed with exhaust fumes and something else, something chemical that made my nose burn slightly. I learned to identify that smell years ago during my training. Industrial runoff, probably from one of the shipping facilities upriver. By 6 o'clock, I was showered, dressed in my standard uniform, and checking my secure phone for the overnight briefings that would determine how my day unfolded. 3 new environmental violations reported along the Pacific Coast Highway, 2 illegal dumping sites discovered in Marin County, 1 corporate facility that had been releasing untreated wastewater into San Francisco Bay for an estimated 6 months before anyone noticed. Standard Tuesday morning in Northern California. The coffee was still brewing when my personal phone buzzed with a text from my sister, Jessica. Annual Rodriguez family beach cleanup this Saturday, Moonstone Beach, 9 a.m. Don't even think about bailing this year, Sarah. Mom's been asking about you. I stared at the message while my coffee finished brewing, steam rising from the pot like some kind of accusation. The Rodriguez family beach cleanup had been a tradition for 12 years now, ever since Jessica married into the family and decided that environmental activism was her calling. Every year, she organized this elaborate community event where dozens of families would descend on whatever beach she'd selected, armed with trash bags and recycling bins and enough enthusiasm to power a small city. Every year she invited me. Every year I found an excuse not to go. It wasn't that I didn't care about the environment. It was complicated. My secure phone buzzed again, this time with coordinates for a site inspection in Pacifica, where someone had reported suspicious barrels washing up on shore. I grabbed my gear bag from beside the door, checked that my credentials were properly secured in their waterproof case, and headed out to my government-issued SUV. The license plates were unmarked, the windows tinted, and the vehicle itself was equipped with enough surveillance and communication equipment to run a small military operation. Most people who saw it probably assumed I worked for some boring federal agency pushing papers around. They weren't entirely wrong. The drive down Highway 1 to Pacifica took 45 minutes in morning traffic, giving me time to review the case files on my tablet. The person who'd reported the barrels was a local surfer named Miguel Santos, who'd been coming to this particular break for 20 years. He knew the difference between normal beach debris and something that didn't belong. According to his statement, the barrels were industrial grade, sealed, and had markings that looked military or government-related. When I arrived at the site, Miguel was waiting for me in the parking lot above the beach, still wearing his wetsuit with a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked to be in his 40s, with the kind of deep tan and weathered hands that came from spending half your life in salt water. When he saw me approaching, his expression shifted to something between confusion and mild disappointment. "You're the federal agent?" he asked, looking me up and down like he was trying to solve a puzzle. I was expecting someone older, or at least someone who looked more official. I was used to this reaction. At 32, I looked young for my position, and the fact that I deliberately kept a low profile meant most people had no idea what I actually did for a living. Even my own family assumed I worked some kind of desk job for the government, filing reports and attending meetings. They weren't completely wrong about the reports and meetings, but they had no idea about the rest of it. "Agent Miller, Environmental Task Force," I said, showing him my credentials. "Tell me about these barrels." Miguel led me down a narrow trail to the beach, pointing toward a cluster of rocks where 3 large drums had washed up with the morning tide. Even from a distance, I could see they were military surplus, the kind used for storing chemical compounds or hazardous materials. The markings were partially obscured by barnacles and seaweed, but I could make out enough to know these had come from a government facility. I spent the next 4 hours documenting everything, taking photographs, collecting water samples, and coordinating with the Coast Guard to trace the barrel's point of origin. By the time I finished, the sun was high enough to burn off the morning fog, and families were starting to arrive for their beach days. Kids running toward the water with surfboards and bodyboards, while parents set up umbrellas and unpacked coolers. This was the part of my job that most people never thought about: the cleanup work, the investigation, and the endless paperwork that followed every environmental incident. They saw the beaches and the ocean and assumed it was all natural, all protected, all taken care of by someone else. They didn't realize how much effort went into keeping the water clean enough for their kids to swim in, or how many battles were fought behind the scenes against corporations and government agencies that treated the environment like their personal dumping ground. My phone buzzed again with a text from Jessica. "Seriously, Sarah, just show up for once. It's one Saturday morning. How busy can your job possibly be?" I looked around at the beach where I had just spent 4 hours investigating potential chemical contamination, where families were now playing in water that might have been exposed to industrial waste, where the barrels I had documented would trigger a federal investigation that could take months to resolve. How busy could my job possibly be? That evening, I sat in my apartment going through the day's reports while the fog rolled back in from the Pacific. My secure laptop displayed satellite imagery of illegal dumping sites, water quality reports from a dozen monitoring stations, and a confidential briefing about a chemical plant in Richmond that had been falsifying its discharge records for the past 2 years. The Rodriguez family beach cleanup information was still open on my personal phone, Jessica's cheerful invitation sitting there like a challenge. The truth was, I'd been avoiding family gatherings for reasons that had nothing to do with my workload. 3 years ago, during the last cleanup event that I had attended, I'd gotten into an argument with Jessica's husband Carlos about environmental policy. He'd been throwing on about how citizen activism was the only way to create real change, how people like him were the true environmental heroes because they volunteered their time and energy for the cause. When I had tried to explain that there were professionals working on these issues full-time, he'd laughed and said that government bureaucrats were part of the problem, not the solution. I'd walked away from that conversation rather than explain what I actually did for a living, rather than tell them about the industrial facilities I had shut down, the corporations I had prosecuted, the environmental crimes I had investigated. It was easier to let them think I was just another government drone than to deal with their assumptions about what real environmental work looked like. But Jessica's invitation this year felt different. Maybe it was because our mother had been asking about me, wondering why I never participate in family activities anymore. Maybe it was because I had spent the morning cleaning up someone else's mess and was tired of being invisible in my own life. Or maybe it was because I'd realized that after 8 years of fighting environmental battles from the inside, I'd forgotten what it felt like to just show up as myself. Thursday morning brought another early alarm and another stack of case files. A paper mill in Humboldt County had been cited for air quality violations. A shipping company in Oakland was under investigation for fuel spills. A housing development in Sonoma was accused of illegally dumping construction waste in protected wetlands. Each case represented months of work, countless hours of investigation, and the kind of bureaucratic warfare that most people couldn't imagine. I was reviewing water samples from the Pacifica site when my supervisor, Director Catherine Hayes, called me into her office. Hayes had been running the Environmental Task Force for 15 years, and she had the kind of reputation that made corporate lawyers nervous and lobbyists uncomfortable. She was also one of the few people who understood what it was like to live a double life, protecting the environment from inside a system that most environmentalists viewed with suspicion. The Pacifica barrels came from Presidio Labs, military contractor, chemical research, the kind of stuff that doesn't officially exist. They've been dumping industrial waste in the bay for at least 6 months, maybe longer. I opened the folder and reviewed the preliminary findings. Presidio Labs was a subsidiary of a larger defense contractor. the kind of company that operated behind layers of security clearances and government contracts. Taking them on would mean dealing with military lawyers, classified information, and the kind of political pressure that could end careers. "How do you want to handle it?" I asked. "Carefully," she said. "We'll need to coordinate with the Pentagon, probably bring in the EPA, and definitely involve the Attorney General's office." This is going to be a long fight, and it's going to get ugly before it gets better. I nodded, already mentally preparing for the months of work ahead. This was what real environmental protection looked like, not the feel-good community cleanups that made people feel better about themselves but didn't address the systemic problems that created the pollution in the first place. It was thankless, complicated, and usually invisible to the general public. Friday evening, I found myself staring at Jessica's invitation again, weighing the pros and cons of actually showing up. Part of me wanted to skip it, like always, and spend Saturday working on the Presidio Labs case. Part of me was curious about what would happen if I actually participated in one of these community events for once. And part of me was just tired of being the family member who never showed up, who always had an excuse, who kept her real life hidden from the people who were supposed to know her best. I texted Jessica back, "I'll try to make it." Her response came back within minutes. "Really? You're actually coming? Don't get my hopes up if you're just going to cancel at the last minute." I said, "I'll try." That's what you always say. "Look, Sarah, I know your job is important to you, but family is important too. Mom's been worried about you. Carlos thinks you don't care about the environment at all. Just show up for once, okay? It's one morning." I stared at that message for a long time. Carlos thinks you don't care about the environment at all. If only he knew that I'd spent the day reviewing evidence of chemical contamination that could affect every beach in Northern California. If only any of them knew what I actually did with my life. Saturday morning came too early, gray and foggy like most summer days in San Francisco. I pulled on old jeans, a faded t-shirt, and hiking boots that had seen better days. No point in dressing up for trash collection. I threw a baseball cap in my bag, along with work gloves and a water bottle, and headed out to my personal car rather than the government SUV. Today, I was just Sarah Rodriguez Miller, reluctant family member and environmental skeptic, not Agent Miller from the federal task force. The drive to Moonstone Beach took an hour and a half, winding through coastal mountains and past small towns that looked like postcards from another era. I'd grown up in one of these towns before college and graduate school and government service had taken me away from the simple certainties of small-town life. My family still lived here, still believed that individual action could change the world, still thought that picking up trash on beaches would somehow solve the environmental crisis. I arrived at the beach parking lot a few minutes after 9, expecting to find the usual handful of dedicated volunteers with their recycling bins and grabber tools. Instead, I found what looked like a small festival. There had to be 60 or 70 people spread across the beach, from toddlers with tiny buckets, to teenagers with headphones, to seniors with folding chairs. Someone had set up a registration table with clipboards and name tags. Someone else was handing out coffee and donuts from the back of a pickup truck. And standing in the middle of it all, wearing a bright green t-shirt that said Beach Captain and holding a megaphone like she was directing a military operation, was my sister Jessica. I parked between a Tesla with environmental bumper stickers and a minivan covered in soccer team decals, feeling like an imposter before I'd even gotten out of my car. Through the windshield, I could see Jessica scanning the crowd with the kind of focused intensity she usually reserved for organizing her kids' school fundraisers. When her eyes found mine across the parking lot, her face lit up with genuine surprise. She jogged over to my car as I was grabbing my water bottle from the passenger seat, her ponytail bouncing with each step. "Sarah, you actually came! I can't believe it! Wait until I tell Mom you're here." "Don't make a big deal out of it," I said, closing the car door with more force than necessary. "I'm just here to pick up some trash and go home." "That's literally all anyone's here to do," Jessica said, linking her arm through mine like we were teenagers again. "Come on, let me introduce you to everyone. Well, most of them anyway. There are way more people than I expected." She guided me toward the registration table, where a woman in her 50s was checking names off a list with the efficiency of someone who'd been organizing community events since before I was born. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore the kind of cocky vest with multiple pockets that suggested she took outdoor activities very seriously. "Sarah, this is Patricia Hendricks," Jessica said. "She's been coordinating beach cleanups all along the coast for the past 15 years. Patricia, this is my sister Sarah, the one I told you about." Patricia looked up from her clipboard and gave me the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The sister who never shows up," she said, making it sound like both a joke and an accusation. "Jessica's told me so much about you. Government job, right? Very busy, very important?" There was something in her tone that immediately put me on edge, the way she emphasized important like it was a dirty word. "Something like that," I said. "Well, it's nice that you could finally find time in your schedule for something that matters to the community," Patricia continued, handing me a clipboard with a waiver to sign. "Though I have to say, I'm surprised Jessica didn't mention that you dress like you're planning to do actual work." I looked down at my jeans and hiking boots, then back at Patricia's spotless cocky outfit. "Should I have worn something else?" "Oh no, that's perfect," she said. "Most of the government people who show up to these things come in their nice clean clothes, take a few photos for social media, and leave. At least you look like you might actually get your hands dirty." Jessica stepped between us with the kind of diplomatic intervention she'd perfected during years of managing difficult PTA meetings. "Patricia's just passionate about the cause," she said quickly. "She's been fighting environmental battles since before it was trendy." "Fighting battles," Patricia repeated, warming to her theme. "That's exactly right. While some people sit in air-conditioned offices pushing papers around, there are those of us out here doing the real work. Day after day, year after year, cleaning up the messes that bureaucrats and politicians are too busy to deal with." I signed the waiver and handed it back to her, forcing myself to keep my expression neutral. "Sounds like you've seen a lot of bureaucrats over the years." "Too many," Patricia said. "They love to show up for the photo opportunities, make speeches about environmental protection, and then disappear when the real work needs to be done. All talk, no action." "Patricia runs the Coastal Conservation Alliance," Jessica explained, either oblivious to the tension or trying to diffuse it. "They've been instrumental in protecting marine habitats all along the Central Coast." 23 years of grassroots environmental activism," Patricia said proudly. "Real change comes from the bottom up, from people who care enough to get their hands dirty, not from some government agency that's probably in the pocket of the same corporations causing the problems in the first place." I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. The Coastal Conservation Alliance. I'd heard of them, of course. They did good work, important work, but they also had a reputation for being suspicious of any environmental effort that didn't originate from their own organizations. Patricia's attitude was unfortunately typical of certain activist circles that viewed any government involvement as automatically suspect. "Well," I said carefully, "I'm sure there's room for different approaches to environmental protection." "Is there?" Patricia asked, tilting her head like she was genuinely curious about my answer. "Because from where I'm standing, the government approach has been a spectacular failure. Corporate polluters get slaps on the wrist, while people like us have to spend our weekends cleaning up their messes." A younger woman approached the registration table carrying a box of garbage bags, temporarily interrupting our conversation. She looked to be in her 20s, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested she'd recently graduated from an environmental studies program and still believed that individual action could save the world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Patricia, should I start distributing these?" the young woman asked. "And where do you want me to set up the sorting station for recyclables?" "That's perfect, Emma," Patricia said, her tone completely different when addressing her volunteer. "Put the sorting station near the waterline where everyone can see it. And make sure people understand that we're documenting everything we collect. Data matters." Emma nodded enthusiastically and headed toward the beach with her box of supplies. Patricia watched her go with the kind of fond expression usually reserved for favorite students. "Emma's been volunteering with us since she graduated from UC Santa Cruz," Patricia told Jessica and me. "Environmental studies degree, completely dedicated to the cause. She understands that real environmentalists don't just talk about change, they make it happen. The implication was clear enough that even Jessica looked uncomfortable. Sarah cares about the environment too, she said defensively. She just expresses it differently. Does she? Patricia asked, turning her attention back to me. How exactly do you express your environmental concerns, Sarah? Besides showing up to community cleanups once every few years. I could feel my professional composure starting to slip. 8 years of dealing with hostile corporate lawyers and uncooperative government officials had given me a thick skin. But there was something particularly grating about being lectured by someone who assumed they knew everything about my life based on a 5-minute conversation. I try to stay informed about environmental issues, I said, keeping my voice level. I follow the science, support evidence-based policy, that sort of thing. Patricia actually laughed. Support evidence-based policy? That's the most bureaucratic non-answer I've ever heard. What does that even mean in practical terms? It means I think environmental protection should be based on data and research rather than good intentions, I said, my patience starting to wear thin. Data and research, Patricia repeated. Let me guess, you're one of those people who thinks we need more studies before we can take action on climate change. More environmental impact assessments before we can protect endangered species. More cost-benefit analyses before we can regulate toxic chemicals. I think we need to understand problems before we can solve them effectively, I said. The problem is corporations dumping poison in our oceans, while government agencies like yours look the other way, Patricia shot back. We don't need more studies to know that. We need action. Jessica was looking back and forth between us like she was watching a tennis match, clearly regretting her decision to introduce us. Maybe we should focus on today's cleanup, she suggested weakly. But Patricia was just getting started. You know what your problem is, Sarah? You're part of a system that prioritizes process over results. While you're sitting in meetings talking about evidence-based policy, the rest of us are out here dealing with the actual consequences of environmental destruction. And you know what your problem is? I said, my professional mask finally slipping completely. You assume that anyone who doesn't approach environmental issues exactly like you do must not care at all. You think passion is more important than expertise, and activism is more valuable than actual results. The conversation had attracted the attention of several nearby volunteers who were pretending to organize their supplies while obviously listening to our argument. Jessica looked mortified. Actual results? Patricia's voice rose slightly. What results has the government produced lately? Name one significant environmental victory that came from federal bureaucrats rather than grassroots activism. I could have listed dozens. The chemical plant in Ridgemont that we'd shut down last year. The shipping company we'd prosecuted for illegal dumping. The military contractor we were currently investigating for contaminating San Francisco Bay. But all of that work was confidential, protected by ongoing investigations and national security classifications. I'm not here to debate environmental policy, I said instead. I'm here to help with the cleanup. Right, Patricia said with obvious disdain. The government employee who doesn't want to talk about government environmental policy. How convenient. Patricia, Jessica interjected. Sarah's not here representing any government agency. She's here as my sister, volunteering her time just like everyone else. Is she? Patricia asked. Because in my experience, government people don't do anything without an ulterior motive. They show up to events like this so they can check a box somewhere, prove they're engaged with the community. Then they go back to their comfortable offices and ignore the real problems. I felt something snap inside me. 24 hours earlier, I'd been documenting chemical contamination that could affect every beach within 50 miles of here. I'd spent the week building a case against a military contractor that was poisoning the same waters these volunteers were trying to protect. I dedicated my entire career to fighting environmental crimes that most of these people didn't even know existed. You have no idea what you're talking about, don't I? Patricia stepped closer, her voice dropping to match mine. I've been doing this work since before you were out of college. I've seen dozens of government representatives come and go, and they're all the same. Big talk, no follow-through. They want credit for caring without doing any of the actual work. The actual work, I repeated. You mean like spending your Saturday picking up other people's trash while feeling superior to anyone who doesn't approach environmental issues exactly like you do? The small crowd of eavesdroppers had grown larger, and I could see people pulling out their phones. This was exactly the kind of scene I'd spent years avoiding. The reason I kept my professional life separate from my personal relationships. At least I'm doing something, Patricia said. At least I'm not hiding behind bureaucratic excuses while the planet burns. And at least I'm not grandstanding for a bunch of volunteers while pretending that beach cleanups are going to solve industrial pollution. Jessica grabbed my arm. Sarah, maybe we should take a walk. But Patricia wasn't finished. Industrial pollution? Now you're an expert on industrial pollution? Let me guess. You read about it in some government report while sitting in your climate-controlled office. That's when I made the mistake. 8 years of professional discipline cracked under the pressure of being lectured by someone who had no idea what real environmental enforcement looked like. Actually, I said, I've been investigating industrial pollution all week. There's a military contractor that's been dumping chemical waste in the bay for months, and we're building a federal case that's going to shut them down permanently. So maybe before you lecture me about government inaction, you should consider that some of us are actually fighting battles you don't even know exist. The effect was immediate and electric. Patricia's face went pale, and the conversations around us stopped dead. Several people who'd been half listening suddenly gave us their full attention. "You're investigating what?" Patricia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Too late, I realized what I'd just done. I'd revealed details of an ongoing federal investigation to a civilian activist who was probably going to broadcast it to every environmental group on the West Coast within an hour. "I misspoke," I said quickly. "I meant hypothetically, the kind of cases the government handles." But Patricia was staring at me with the intensity of someone who'd just solved a puzzle she'd been working on for years. "No, you didn't misspeak. You said, we're building a federal case. Who's we, Sarah? What agency do you work for?" Jessica was looking at me with confusion and growing alarm. "Sarah, what's she talking about?" The crowd around us had grown larger, and I could see phones being held up to record whatever was about to happen next. This was a disaster. A career-ending, security clearance destroying, federal investigation compromising disaster. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Environmental Task Force," Patricia said suddenly, her eyes widening with recognition. "You're federal law enforcement. That's why you look so young but talk like you've been doing this forever. That's why you know about ongoing investigations." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I could see understanding dawning on Jessica's face, followed immediately by hurt and anger. The volunteers around us were murmuring to each other, and I caught fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. Did she say Environmental Task Force? Is she some kind of undercover agent? Why would a federal agent be at a community cleanup? Patricia stepped back from me like I was contaminated. "You're not here as Jessica's sister. You're here in some kind of professional capacity. This whole conversation, this whole argument, you've been lying about who you are." "That's not true," I said, but even I could hear how unconvincing it sounded. "Isn't it?" Patricia's voice was rising again, but now it carried a note of betrayal rather than just anger. "How long have you been investigating local environmental groups? Are we under surveillance? Is this some kind of federal sting operation?" "Patricia, that's ridiculous," Jessica said, but she was looking at me with questions I couldn't answer. "Is it?" Patricia turned to address the growing crowd of volunteers. "Everyone, I need your attention. This woman is a federal agent who's been lying about her identity since the moment she arrived. We have no way of knowing why she's really here or what information she's been gathering about our activities." The crowd's reaction was swift and alarmed. People started backing away from me like I was dangerous. parents pulling their children closer, teenagers holding up their phones to record what was clearly about to become a viral video. "I'm not investigating anyone here," I said loudly, trying to address the crowd directly. "I came here as a volunteer, nothing more." "Then why did you lie about who you work for?" Patricia demanded. "Why didn't you identify yourself as law enforcement when you signed the waiver? Why are you really here?" I looked around at the faces surrounding me, seeing fear and suspicion and anger where moments before there had been curiosity and community spirit. These were good people, dedicated people who'd given up their Saturday morning to clean up a beach. They didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of my professional complications. "I didn't lie," I said carefully. "I just didn't volunteer information about my job because it wasn't relevant to today's activities." "Wasn't relevant?" Patricia's voice carried across the beach now, attracting the attention of volunteers who'd been working near the water. "A federal law enforcement officer shows up to a grassroots environmental event without identifying herself, and that's not relevant?" More people were approaching, drawn by the commotion. I could see the crowd growing larger and more agitated by the minute. Someone in the back was shouting questions I couldn't quite make out. Cell phones were everywhere, recording everything. Jessica grabbed my shoulder. "Sarah, we need to leave, now." But Patricia wasn't finished. "I want to know exactly what agency you work for and why you're here. Are you investigating the Coastal Conservation Alliance? Are we under some kind of federal surveillance because we've been critical of government environmental policy?" "The Environmental Task Force doesn't investigate citizen groups," I said, trying to project calm authority while internally calculating how much damage control I was going to need to do. "We investigate environmental crimes committed by corporations and government agencies." "Then why are you here?" someone shouted from the crowd. "And why didn't you tell us who you were?" I looked at Jessica, who was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Hurt, confusion, and something that might have been fear. "You're really a federal agent?" she asked quietly. "All these years? All the times I've invited you to family events and environmental activities, you've been some kind of law enforcement officer?" The hurt in her voice was worse than Patricia's anger or the crowd's suspicion. This was my sister, someone who'd been trying to include me in her life for years while I'd been pushing her away to protect a cover identity that had just been blown in the most public way possible. "Jessica, I can explain everything," I said. "Can you?" Patricia stepped between us again. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to your own family about who you are. What else have you been lying about?" The situation was spiraling completely out of control. I could see people in the crowd filming everything, probably streaming live to social media. Within hours, this would be everywhere. A federal agent getting exposed at a community beach cleanup by local environmental activists. My supervisor was going to kill me. The ongoing investigation into Presidio Labs could be compromised. My entire career could be over. "I think," I said loudly, addressing the crowd, "there's been a serious misunderstanding here. I came here today as a private citizen, volunteering for a community cleanup." "My professional life has nothing to do with today's activities." "Then why bring it up?" Patricia shot back. "Why mention ongoing federal investigations if your professional life isn't relevant?" I had no good answer for that question. I'd mentioned the investigation because I was angry, because I wanted to prove that I knew more about environmental issues than she assumed. It had been unprofessional, stupid, and potentially catastrophic. "Look," I said, trying one more time to defuse the situation, "I understand that my presence here has created some confusion. Perhaps it would be best if I just left." "Perhaps it would," Patricia agreed. "But first, I think we deserve some answers. What agency do you work for exactly? What kind of environmental crimes do you investigate? And why should we trust anything you've told us today?" The crowd pressed closer, phones held high, voices rising with questions and accusations.
I looked around for an escape route and realized I was completely surrounded by people who now viewed me as some kind of federal infiltrator rather than Jessica's antisocial sister. That's when I heard the sound that changed everything. The distant whump, whump, whump of helicopter rotors cut through the morning air, growing louder by the second. Everyone on the beach turned toward the sound, shading their eyes against the sun as a black helicopter with federal markings appeared over the coastal hills. It wasn't the kind of aircraft you saw at community events, and it definitely wasn't heading anywhere else. It was coming straight for us. "What the hell is that?" someone in the crowd muttered. The helicopter circled the beach once before landing in the parking lot, its rotors whipping sand and debris into tiny tornadoes that sent people scrambling to protect their eyes. Through the chaos, I could see official vehicles pulling into the lot behind it. 3 black SUVs with government plates and enough antennas to run a small communications center. Patricia grabbed my arm as the helicopter powered down. "Did you call for backup?" she demanded. "Is this some kind of raid?" I was as surprised as anyone. I had no idea why federal resources were being deployed to a community beach cleanup, and I definitely hadn't called for any kind of assistance. But as the helicopter door opened and I saw who stepped out, my stomach dropped straight through the sand. Director Catherine Hayes emerged from the aircraft wearing tactical gear and the kind of expression that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. She was followed by 2 other agents I recognized from headquarters, both armed and moving with the purposeful efficiency of people responding to a crisis. The crowd around me erupted in confusion and fear. Parents started gathering their children, while teenagers filmed everything with shaking hands. Someone was shouting about police state tactics, while another voice called out that they hadn't done anything wrong. "Sarah Miller," Director Hayes called across the beach, her voice carrying easily over the noise. "I need to speak with you immediately." The entire crowd turned to stare at me, and I could see Patricia's face cycling through confusion, recognition, and what might have been terror. Jessica looked like she was about to be sick. "Sarah Miller?" Patricia whispered. "Not Sarah Rodriguez." Director Hayes was walking toward us now, her 2 agents flanking her like an honor guard. She wore the kind of tactical vest that suggested this wasn't a social call, and her expression was grim enough to make my blood run cold. "Agent Miller," she said when she reached our group, completely ignoring the crowd of civilians surrounding us. "We have a situation. Presidio Labs has accelerated their timeline. They're moving to destroy evidence tonight, and we need to execute the raid immediately." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. I could feel Patricia staring at me with the intensity of someone whose entire worldview was being reconstructed in real time. "Agent Miller?" Patricia repeated slowly. "You're actually a federal agent?" Director Hayes glanced around at the crowd for the first time, taking in the cell phones, the recording equipment, and the faces of people who were clearly not supposed to be hearing about classified operations. "Why are you discussing active investigations in front of civilians?" she asked me quietly, but not quietly enough to be overheard. "It's complicated," I said, which was possibly the understatement of my career. "Uncomplicated quickly," Hayes replied. "We have a chemical contamination case that's about to go sideways, and I need my lead investigator focused on actual federal crimes instead of whatever this is." One of the other agents, someone I recognized as Special Agent Torres from the Oakland field office, approached our group with his credentials already displayed. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to need everyone to step back and give us some space to brief Agent Miller on an urgent matter of national security." The crowd began backing away, but slowly, reluctantly, still filming everything. Patricia remained rooted in place, staring at me like I was an entirely different person than the one she'd been arguing with 10 minutes earlier. "Agent Miller?" she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're really a federal law enforcement officer?" "Environmental Task Force," I confirmed, finally giving up any pretense. "Special Agent Sarah Miller, badge number 7749, assigned to the Northern California Division for the past 8 years. 8 years, Jessica repeated hollowly. You've been a federal agent for 8 years and never told your own family? Director Hayes was checking her watch with the impatience of someone whose carefully planned operation was being disrupted by family drama. Agent Miller, we really need to move on this. The chemistry analysis from Pacifica came back, and what they're dumping is worse than we initially thought. Carcinogenic compounds, endocrine disruptors, the kind of stuff that bioaccumulates in marine ecosystems. Presidio Labs, Patricia said suddenly, her environmental activist instincts overriding her shock. That's the military contractor that's been dumping in the bay. I've been trying to get information about them for months, but nobody would tell us anything. Hayes gave her a sharp look. And you are? Patricia Hendricks, Coastal Conservation Alliance. We've been documenting unusual pollution patterns all along this stretch of coast. Dead fish, discolored water, chemical odors. But every time we tried to get officials to investigate, we were told there was no evidence of industrial contamination. Because it was classified, I said. Military contractor, government facility, the whole operation was protected by national security protocols. We couldn't share information about an ongoing investigation without compromising our ability to build a prosecutable case. Patricia's expression was shifting from shock to understanding to something that might have been respect. You've been investigating them this whole time? While I was accusing you of government inaction, you were actually building a case? A case that's about to be destroyed if we don't move immediately. Agent Miller, I need you suited up and ready to execute search warrants within the hour. We have intelligence that they're planning to destroy documents and chemical samples tonight. Search warrants, Patricia repeated. You're actually going to raid them? We're going to shut them down, I said, surprised by how good it felt to finally tell the truth about what I did for a living. Presidio Labs has been illegally dumping industrial chemicals into protected marine environments for at least 6 months.
They've violated the Clean Water Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and probably a dozen other federal environmental statutes. Agent Torres was monitoring his radio and looking increasingly urgent. Director, we're getting reports that trucks are already loading equipment at the facility. If we don't move soon, we're going to lose critical evidence. Hayes nodded grimly. Agent Miller, I need you and that helicopter in 5 minutes. Full tactical gear, search warrants, evidence collection equipment. This is what we've been building toward for months. I looked around at the crowd of volunteers who were now staring at me with expressions ranging from awe to confusion to lingering suspicion. These were people who'd spent years fighting environmental battles with recycling bins and beach cleanups, while I'd been fighting the same battles with federal law enforcement powers they didn't even know existed. This is really happening? Emma, the young volunteer with the environmental studies degree, pushed forward through the crowd. You're actually going to arrest the people who've been poisoning our water? If we can prove criminal intent and environmental damage, yes, I said. That's what the Environmental Task Force does. We investigate environmental crimes and prosecute the people responsible. Environmental crimes, Patricia said slowly. All this time, when I was criticizing government inaction on environmental issues, there were actually federal agents working these cases? There are 47 agents in the Northern California Environmental Task Force, Hayes said, checking her watch again. Agent Miller is one of our most experienced investigators. She's built cases against chemical companies, shipping corporations, illegal dumping operations, and government facilities that violate environmental law. Government facilities? Patricia looked confused. I thought the government was supposed to protect the environment, not violate it. Military contractors aren't technically government, I explained. They're private companies with government contracts, and they sometimes think those contracts protect them from environmental prosecution. They're wrong. Agent Torres was getting increasingly agitated. Director, we really need to move. Every minute we delay gives them more time to destroy evidence. But Hayes was studying the crowd of volunteers with the calculating expression of someone who'd spent years managing public relations disasters. Actually, she said thoughtfully, maybe we can turn this situation to our advantage. What do you mean? I asked. You just exposed a classified operation to a group of environmental activists who've been documenting the same pollution patterns we've been investigating.
Instead of treating this as a security breach, maybe we treat it as an opportunity for community involvement. What do you mean? I asked. You just exposed a classified operation to a group of environmental activists who've been documenting the same pollution patterns we've been investigating. Instead of treating this as a security breach, maybe we treat it as an opportunity for community involvement. Patricia stepped forward. Community involvement in what? Environmental monitoring, Hayes said. The Coastal Conservation Alliance has been collecting data on pollution patterns, correct? Water samples, photographic documentation, fish kills, unusual chemical odors? For months, Patricia confirmed. But nobody would listen to us. Every agency we contacted said they needed more evidence before they could investigate. Because we couldn't acknowledge an ongoing federal investigation without compromising it, I said. But now that the investigation is about to conclude, your documentation could be valuable evidence for prosecution. Emma was practically vibrating with excitement. You mean our volunteer monitoring data could actually be used in court? If it's properly documented and scientifically valid, yes, Hayes said. Environmental crimes are often difficult to prosecute because the evidence is scattered and complex. Citizen science data can be incredibly valuable for establishing patterns of environmental damage. The mood of the crowd was shifting dramatically. Where minutes before there had been suspicion and hostility, now there was curiosity and growing excitement. These were people who'd spent years feeling powerless against corporate environmental destruction, and suddenly they were being told their volunteer efforts could contribute to actual prosecutions. This is incredible, someone called out from the back of the crowd. We've been documenting chemical smells and dead fish for months, and now you're saying it could help put polluters in jail? If we can execute this raid successfully and collect sufficient evidence, yes, I said. But we need to move immediately. Every minute we delay gives Presidio Labs more time to destroy documents and dispose of chemical evidence. Jessica, who'd been silent throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke up. Sarah, is this really what you do for a living? You arrest people who pollute the environment? Among other things, yes. I investigate environmental crimes, build federal cases, and coordinate with prosecutors to hold polluters accountable under environmental law. And you never told us? Because I looked at my sister, seeing hurt and confusion, but also something that might have been pride. Because most of my work is classified until cases go to trial. Because I couldn't risk compromising investigations by talking about them. And because I thought you wouldn't understand the difference between government bureaucracy and actual law enforcement. The difference, Patricia said quietly, is that you're actually doing something about environmental crimes instead of just talking about them. Agent Torres was practically bouncing with impatience. Director, we've got to move. The surveillance team reports increasing activity at the facility. If we don't execute these warrants in the next hour, we're going to lose this opportunity. Hayes made her decision. Agent Miller, you're coming with us. Full tactical deployment, evidence collection, the works. This is the culmination of 8 months of investigation, and I want you there when we shut them down. I looked around at the crowd of volunteers one more time, seeing faces that had gone from suspicion to understanding to excitement in the space of 20 minutes. These were people who cared about the same things I cared about, who'd been fighting the same battles with different tools. Patricia, I said, I want you to document everything that happens here today. Every witness, every statement, every piece of evidence these volunteers have collected. If this case goes to trial, we may need community testimony about the environmental impact. You want us to be witnesses in a federal environmental case? Patricia asked. I want you to be partners in environmental protection, I said. The government can prosecute polluters, but communities like yours are the ones who notice the problems first. We need each other. Emma pulled out her phone and started typing frantically. I'm calling everyone from the marine biology program at UC Santa Cruz. They've been documenting unusual algae blooms and fish die-offs all along this coast. If you need scientific evidence of environmental damage, we can provide it. The transformation was remarkable. Minutes earlier, these same people had been viewing me as a potential threat, a federal infiltrator disrupting their community activism. Now they were volunteering to support a federal environmental prosecution with the enthusiasm of people who'd finally found a way to make their activism count. Hayes was strapping on tactical equipment with practiced efficiency. "Agent Miller, gear up. We've got warrants to serve and environmental criminals to arrest." I started toward the helicopter, then turned back to address the crowd one more time.
Everything you've been doing here matters. Every beach cleanup, every water sample, every photograph of environmental damage contributes to our understanding of what's happening to these ecosystems. Don't stop doing this work just because federal agents are involved now. "Are you kidding?" Patricia called out. "This is the most hope I've had about environmental enforcement in 20 years. We're going to document everything, and we're going to make sure every environmental crime in Northern California gets reported to your task force." Jessica caught up with me as I reached the helicopter. "Sarah, I'm sorry I never understood what you really do. I thought you were just another government bureaucrat who didn't care about the environment." "I'm sorry I never told you the truth," I said, pulling on tactical gear that felt strange after a morning of family drama. "I wanted to keep you safe from the complications of my job, but I ended up making you think I didn't care about the things that matter to you." "The things that matter to both of us," Jessica corrected. "Next year's beach cleanup is going to be very different." "Next year's beach cleanup might not be necessary," I said, checking my weapon and evidence collection equipment. "If we do this right, Presidio Labs won't be dumping chemicals anymore." Director Hayes appeared beside us, fully equipped and ready for what was clearly going to be a complex operation. "Agent Miller, you ready to shut down some environmental criminals?" "I've been ready for 8 months," I said, climbing into the helicopter. As we lifted off from the beach, I could see the crowd of volunteers below us, still gathered around Patricia and Emma, phones out and excitement building. They were no longer just community activists picking up trash on a Saturday morning. They were witnesses, evidence collectors, and partners in environmental protection. The helicopter banked toward the coast, heading for a military contractor that had no idea their illegal dumping operation was about to end. In my earpiece, I could hear radio chatter coordinating search teams, evidence collection units, and arrest protocols. "Agent Miller," Hayes said over the helicopter noise, "after we finish shutting down Presidio Labs, I want you to develop a protocol for community partnership in environmental investigations. What happened back there, that kind of local knowledge and volunteer monitoring, could revolutionize how we detect environmental crimes." I looked back toward the beach, where my sister and Patricia and dozens of other volunteers were probably already planning how to support federal environmental enforcement with their grassroots monitoring efforts. For the first time in 8 years, my two worlds had collided and somehow made each other stronger. "Copy that, Director," I said, checking my equipment one final time. "But first, let's go arrest some polluters." The helicopter flew toward the Presidio Labs facility, carrying federal agents with search warrants and the authority to shut down environmental criminals. Behind us, community volunteers were documenting evidence and preparing to support prosecution efforts with their own environmental monitoring data. It wasn't the beach cleanup any of us had expected, but it might have been the most important environmental action any of us had ever taken. The Presidio Labs facility looked deceptively peaceful from the air, a cluster of industrial buildings nestled between rolling hills and the Pacific coastline. But as our helicopter circled for landing, I could see trucks loading equipment in the back lot and smoke rising from what was probably an industrial incinerator working overtime to destroy evidence. "They know we're coming," Agent Torres observed through his headset. "Too late now," Director Hayes replied grimly as we touched down in the facility's parking lot. The raid itself unfolded with the precision of months of planning. Search warrants were served simultaneously at 3 buildings, while evidence collection teams secured chemical storage areas and computer systems. Within 30 minutes, we had detained 4 executives and seized thousands of documents detailing illegal dumping operations that had been contaminating San Francisco Bay for nearly 2 years. The real breakthrough came when we discovered their internal communications. Email chains between company executives and government contract administrators showing they knew exactly what chemicals they were dumping and exactly how much environmental damage they were causing. They'd calculated the potential fines and decided that illegal dumping was more cost-effective than proper waste disposal. "Look at this," Agent Torres called from one of the computer workstations.
They have detailed maps showing exactly where they've been dumping, GPS coordinates, chemical composition data, everything we need for prosecution. But the most damning evidence was in their laboratory. Tanks full of chemical compounds that were supposed to have been disposed of through licensed hazardous waste facilities, instead sitting in storage while cheaper dumping operations continued. Water samples from their own monitoring showed contamination levels that were hundreds of times above legal limits. "This is a prosecutor's dream," Hayes said, photographing evidence with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent months building an airtight case. They documented their own crimes. By evening, Presidio Labs had been shut down completely. 4 executives were in federal custody, facing charges that could result in decades in prison and millions in fines. The facility was sealed pending environmental remediation that would take months to complete. But the real surprise came the next morning when Patricia called my personal phone. "Sarah, you need to see what's happening at the beach," she said, her voice filled with excitement. I drove back to Moonstone Beach, expecting to find the usual quiet coastline, but instead discovered what looked like a scientific expedition. Dozens of volunteers were spread across the beach and surrounding areas, collecting water samples, photographing evidence, and documenting environmental conditions with the precision of trained researchers. Emma approached me carrying a tablet full of data and wearing the kind of focused expression usually reserved for graduate students defending their dissertations. "Agent Miller, we've documented 17 separate pollution incidents along this stretch of coast in the past 24 hours. Chemical odors, discolored water, unusual foam patterns, everything." 17 incidents? Once people knew what to look for and understood that their reports would actually be investigated, the information started pouring in. Fishermen who'd been noticing dead fish for months, surfers who'd been getting chemical burns, families who'd been avoiding certain beaches because their kids got sick after swimming. "We've created a database," Emma continued enthusiastically. "GPS coordinates, photographic evidence, water sample analysis, witness statements, everything properly documented according to federal evidence standards." The transformation was remarkable. These volunteers had gone from feeling powerless against environmental destruction to becoming active partners in environmental enforcement. They understood now that their observations mattered, that their documentation could contribute to actual prosecutions. "There's something else," Patricia said, guiding me toward a group of volunteers clustered around a laptop computer. "We've been in contact with environmental groups all along the Pacific coast. Turns out similar pollution patterns have been reported from San Diego to Seattle, all potentially connected to military contractors with federal dumping permits." "You're talking about a coordinated investigation spanning multiple states," I said, understanding the implications immediately. "We're talking about citizen scientists providing ground-level intelligence for federal environmental enforcement," Patricia corrected. "Your raid on Presidio Labs proved that government agencies can and will take action against environmental criminals. Now we want to help you find all of them." Jessica appeared at my elbow, still looking slightly dazed by everything that had happened. "Sarah, Mom wants to know if you can come to dinner Sunday night. She has some questions about your job." "What kind of questions?" "The kind where she wants to brag about her daughter, the federal agent, to everyone at church," Jessica said with a smile. "Turns out having a daughter who arrests environmental criminals is pretty impressive, even if she was too stubborn to tell anyone about it." 3 months later, the Coastal Conservation Alliance had evolved into something unprecedented in environmental activism. They'd partnered with the Environmental Task Force to create a citizen monitoring network that covered the entire Pacific coast, providing real-time intelligence about potential environmental crimes to federal investigators. Patricia's organization now had direct communication channels with federal environmental enforcement, trained volunteers in evidence collection protocols, and contributed to prosecutions that resulted in actual consequences for environmental criminals rather than just symbolic protests. Emma had been hired as a liaison between community groups and federal agencies, coordinating citizen science efforts with official investigations. Her environmental studies degree had become the foundation for a career in environmental law enforcement that combined academic knowledge with grassroots activism. And I'd finally learned to appreciate the difference between government bureaucracy and community partnership. The volunteers I'd once dismissed as naive idealists had proven to be invaluable sources of environmental intelligence, while the federal resources I'd protected so carefully became far more effective when combined with community knowledge and support. The beach cleanup that was supposed to last one morning became the most successful environmental enforcement partnership in Northern California history. Presidio Labs was facing federal prosecution that would result in prison time for executives and complete environmental remediation of contaminated sites. More importantly, dozens of other potential environmental crimes were being investigated based on citizen reports that were now taken seriously by federal authorities. Sometimes, the most powerful environmental protection comes from the intersection of federal law enforcement and community activism. Sometimes, the people picking up trash on beaches are exactly the partners that federal agents need to hold environmental criminals accountable. And sometimes, admitting you've been wrong about everything is the first step toward building something better than anything you could have accomplished alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.